All right, so today we're going to be going through a lesson on counterplans. This is yet another example of a high tech argument that generally isn't run in traditional LD, and especially people aren't going to want to use these terms, but it's something that you can still see very often and perhaps even run yourself. For instance, I've seen a lot of counterplans under this past November December topic about the federal jobs guarantee, saying that instead of having a federal jobs guarantee, we should have a universal basic income. That'd be an example of a counterplan. And we'll go through and explain how that is, but that's one that we see is very prevalent under this last topic. Before we actually get into this, I would like to state that using counterplans are dangerous for sure, due to the fact that they are technically not against the rules in LD, but they are somewhat frowned upon in the traditional circuit. In fact, I had a round where the judge did not write it on the ballot, but they did make comments to other competitors after the round because my opponent used a counterplan, and they said that they didn't feel like it was very it was abusive to actually use a counter plan in an LD round. So you do definitely run that risk whenever you use a counter plan. But even if you decide that that risk isn't worth it and you don't want to run them personally, as we just talked about, they are still used by other people. And we'll also go over how you can respond to counter plans and have good rebuttals under any negative argument that uses them. So let's get into it. First, let's just go over what a counterplan is. We already touched upon it a little bit, but it's a specific type of negative argument that argues that we should do something instead of affirming the resolution, which would be for the purpose of trying to achieve what the affirmative side does. So, for instance, when we're talking about the federal jobs guarantee, its point is to try and do what the federal jobs guarantee is meant to do, such as reducing poverty, without actually having the affirmative plan of the federal jobs guarantee. The reason behind why a lot of people do this is that sometimes the status quo isn't really easy to argue for. The last topic isn't a super great example of it because although the status quo wasn't great, it was definitely okay to argue for. But there are some topics where you are debating about something let's take the plea bargaining topic that we had a long time ago. It was probably 2017. So the issue with that is they was talk about how we should remove plea bargaining to help the criminal justice system. So the negative side had to protect the current state of the criminal justice system, but obviously there's a lot of issues with the criminal justice system, and the removing plea bargaining would solve a lot of those. So the goal of using a counter plan there would say that, well, we don't want to protect the status quo because it's not very good, and we don't. There's not a whole lot to protect. But I have another way to solve those issues instead. That way I don't have to protect the status quo, but also I can still say that the affirmative side isn't our best option. So let's get into the actual parts of a counterplan. The first thing you're going to want to do is have your counterplan text. Now, in the national circuit, where this argument or type of argument originates from, they'll literally say counterplan text and then state what they're going to do. So counterplan text, the United States ought to have a universal basic income. Of course, since we don't want to make it super explicit like they do there, since we have a lot of judges who don't know what things like counterplans mean, we don't want to actually do that. But we still do want to make it clear what we're going to do. In most cases, you can simply have this as a contention. In fact, you could literally say, contention 1, the United States instead ought to put forth a universal basic income. You just want to make it clear so your opponent and your judge both know what you're talking about before we get into the actual intricacies of the counterplan itself. This part's pretty self-explanatory. The next part is going to be competition. This is a part that is often missing from counterplans, and it makes it really easy to attack, which we'll get into later. But this is just to say it's to prove both how it is not what the affirmative side is arguing for, and also that the affirmative side cannot do this as well. This is to make it to where it's very clear that the negative side is arguing for this specific plan of attack, and the affirmative side is advocating for this other completely distinct plan of attack on their end. This makes it to where it's very clear what you're voting for if you vote for the affirmative or the negative side. It just makes it a lot easier on the judge. And as I just mentioned, as we'll get into answering counterplans, it's key to making sure that there aren't big holes in your argument. And then you have a net benefit. So there's going to be a couple things that happens here. First, you're going to want to state why your counterplan actually is good, and it's going to be, as we stated before, because it achieves a lot of what the affirmative side is arguing for. So with the universal basic income example that we were talking about, the goal was to reduce poverty without having the federal jobs guarantee. Additionally, though, you need to add something else to that, because if the only thing your counterplan does, and therefore your negative case does, is achieve what the affirmative side is achieving, then there's no reason to vote for your side. You're just doing exactly what the affirmative side is, and so it's like a wash, right? So you need to combine another argument with it. And normally it's going to be a disadvantage. And the reason behind this is that you're saying that you're going to do everything else that the affirmative side is doing, but without doing this bad thing that the affirmative side does. So, for instance, for the universal basic income, the disadvantage I saw a lot was forcing people to work in like low, not low wage jobs, but like demeaning jobs, such as like picking up trash, which I don't think was a particularly strong argument, but that's a disadvantage. They're saying that people's mental health are going to be harmed because they're working in these degrading jobs. And so instead, we should have a universal basic income, which helps reduce poverty like the federal jobs guarantee does, but without forcing people to work those jobs. That would be the net benefit. So obviously, we need to have some combination there to actually have a reason to vote for the negative side. So now let's go on to how we can actually answer counterplans, and there's going to be three main ways that we can do it. So the first is going to be a permutation. This goes back to that competition argument that we were talking about before. That's because whenever we have a permutation, literally the only argument you're making is that you are going to do the counterplan yourself on the affirmative side. Remember that now we are on the affirmative side responding to the counterplan. So if the counterplans aren't competitive enough, then you can simply say, I'll do both of them. So for instance, it didn't really work under the universal basic income example, but it would be because like you would still produce the harm, right? Like people would still be working these degrading jobs. But the argument would be we should have a universal basic income and the federal jobs guarantee. There's good competition on that counterplan, though, because doing both of them, although possible, isn't desirable. So another one that people used a lot that was slightly better was under the nuclear weapons topic. People would use one that would say, instead of getting rid of nuclear arsenals, we should have a no first use agreement with countries, saying that no one will fire nuclear weapons unless they are 100% certain that another nation has fired nuclear weapons at them. So an affirmative perm would be saying we should remove nuclear arsenals, which was the affirmative plan, and still put forth a no first use policy just in case. So obviously that would be a slightly better one. Additionally, you don't have to do the entire plan. You can do non-competitive parts because sometimes there is competition in the entire plan, but if we cut out certain parts of it, we can still do part of the counter plan and receive the net benefit without doing the entire thing. But the whole idea behind a permutation just in general is to say that the affirmative side can do what the negative side is doing as well. Like they're not special. And we can also do the affirmative plan, which still produces some other benefit generally outlined in the affirmative case. Obviously, once again, it is important to take note here that on the national circuit, they'll literally say, like, perm do both, and then that's just their response. It's like, I can do both of them, but we don't want to do that here. You want to go through and say, like, the negative side can bring forth this universal basic income, and it may be useful, but even if it is, the affirmative side can do it as well. Like, you just want to make sure you word it in a way like that to make it abundantly clear to your judge what you're saying. Another way that you can attack counterplans is by a solvency deficit, which is to say that the counterplan doesn't actually help achieve what it says it is. So obviously, as we already stated, the point of a counterplan is to achieve the affirmative advantages, the reasons why affirming the resolution would be good. But if you can go up there and prove that the counterplan actually doesn't get those advantages, or at least not as well as the affirmative plan does, then that's still a reason to vote for the affirmative side. Obviously, saying that they don't achieve it at all would be the best argument, but even just simply saying, I still make things the best. So let's say that with the universal basic income argument, you would say, sure, the universal basic income can reduce poverty, but not as much as a federal jobs guarantee. That would be an example of a solvency deficit where you don't necessarily say that they don't solve at all, but you're still giving a reason to vote for the affirmative side because you solve better. Although, obviously, once again, it would be better to say that they don't solve it all because then there's absolutely no reason to vote for the negative side. Lastly, we also have offense, which would obviously be the best answer to a counter plan, especially in traditional LD, and we'll get to why in a second. But it's literally saying that the counter plan is actually a reason to vote for the affirmative side because the counter plan is so ineffective that it's going to make the world and society around us worse. So this is actually one that I used a lot for the universal basic income because what I said is that the way they're going to get funding for it is by pulling from welfare. So now we're taking the money which we were giving just to people who needed it under welfare, and now we're giving it to everyone. Therefore, people in poverty are getting less help. Therefore, there are going to be more people in poverty because welfare isn't being effective. That'd be an example of offense because I'm saying that their counterplan is actually harming society by increasing poverty. Like I said, this is actually a reason to vote for the affirmative side. The other arguments we were giving were just saying that we shouldn't vote for the negative side, and then your advantages still have to stand. But even if your opponent were able to prove that the federal jobs guarantee doesn't help people, if you were still able to prove that their counterplan is making the world worse, that's still a reason to vote for the affirmative side, because even if it's just like what is happening right now in the normal world, that's better than having this world under, say, the universal basic income that makes things worse. This is especially good in traditional LD because in Nat Circuit LD, you can just get rid of the counter plan. If they have a really good argument that says that you're actually making the world worse with the counter plan, then they simply won't go for it in the next speech. They'll just drop it completely and say focus on their disadvantage. That's an option you have in Nat Circuit, but we don't have it in traditional LD. It looks really bad if you just simply say, I'm not going to address this argument anymore. And ditching an argument like that really isn't something that you ever see. So that's all the more reason that this argument is better in traditional LD, because if you can put good offense on the counter plan, then they can't get rid of it, and they're either going to have to respond to that offense or lose. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot more to say about counter plans. As I've already stated, they're not going to be overly prevalent in LD, but it's important that you understand the basic ideas behind them and the basic arguments against them. That way you can be better prepared if you ever do see them around, because I'm sure throughout 4 years of high school debating, someone is going to run it under some topic. So it's good to have that background knowledge. But otherwise, there's not too much to say about them. I hope this video, although a little bit shorter, gave you all the information you needed, and I